In an in-depth interview, Ed Miliband, Britain's Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, said getting a global deal on climate change was vital.
6 months till Copenhagen. How important is it to get a global deal on climate change on the table?
I think it is really make or break for the world to get a deal in Copenhagen, because we know the urgency of tackling climate change. We know what the science is telling us. The scientific reports that come out successively show that climate change is not only happening, but happening faster than we previously thought. We have, I think, a unique opportunity. We've got new leadership in the United States from President Obama. We've got China, I think, that wants a global deal. We've got countries like Mexico that are showing that developing countries want to play their part in this process. So I think we've got to strive all out for a global deal at Copenhagen, and I think the discussions in Mexico as part of the Major Economies Forum are a very important step on the road to that.
What are we doing here in the UK on climate change, and in which areas could we do more?
In the United Kingdom, we've set an 80% target for 2050 for the reduction in our carbon emissions. But we haven't just set a target, we've legislated for that through Parliament. And we've also set out some pretty tough interim targets, so a reduction of about 1/3 in our climate change emissions, our carbon emissions by 2020. Now, what does that then mean? It means a big change in the way we power people's homes and businesses in the UK, so moving towards much more renewable forms of power, moving towards new nuclear power stations in the UK, which we think are good for cutting carbon emissions. A big drive on energy efficiency in people's homes, and a big 10-year drive to really make a difference on energy efficiency, because the less energy you use, the less carbon you emit, and a big drive in the transport sector for the new cutting-edge transport technology like electric cars, for example, which again can reduce emissions. So it's a big transformation of the way of life across all sectors of the economy. There's always more you can do in all of these sectors, and as I say, all of the evidence is that the science is more demanding, not less demanding, and therefore we need to do more, and we're very conscious of that.
Tell me about the role of the MEF. What do we want it to achieve?
The Major Economies Forum is a very important place where the major economies of the world can come together. They represent about 80 to 90% of global emissions. So we have the UN process of 180 countries or so that is continuing up to December. But a smaller group of countries is perhaps easier to facilitate the kind of discussions that we need, more informal discussions than the formal UN negotiations. So the UN remains a very important overarching framework for the negotiations, but more informal discussions can take place in the Major Economies Forum. It is a very important place to exchange candidly views and chart the way forward through this very difficult process.
What roles will need to be played by developed as well as developing countries on this issue?
Developed countries need to show leadership, and that's very important. And that's why in the UK and in the European Union, indeed, we've set out some pretty stretching targets. I think the United States recognises the leadership role that it has to play. And in a sense, there's two truths which might seem incompatible, but are actually compatible in these discussions. If you look historically at global emissions, the US is responsible for about 30% of global emissions since 1850 to 2000. The EU is responsible for about the same, 30%, and China only about 6% of emissions. That shows why developed countries have to take on the initial responsibility for some pretty tough targets. But then the seeming paradox, is that if you then look forward, about 75% of the growth in emissions is due to come in developing countries. And that really explains to me why you need both parties in this deal.
Tell me about the role of future financial mechanisms which will enable poorer countries to meet the challenges of adapting to climate change.
We need a future financial mechanism to make this difference. I said that about 3/4 of the growth in emissions was going to come in developing countries. But the combination, to my mind, of our historic responsibilities in developed countries for the growth in emissions that's taken place already, and the levels of development that we have, and the need for developing countries to take people out of poverty, and indeed their current per capita emissions, which tend to be lower than developed countries, all point to us in developed countries playing a part in helping developing countries adapt through finance, through financial flows, and through technology. And both of those, technology cooperation, and both of those are important. Now, I think we've got to design a financial system that over time will change, so that countries that start off as net contributors to the system as they develop, net recipients from the system, might become net contributors to the system over time. So finance is crucial. I understand why developing countries emphasise it as important. I think it's important. It's got to be part of a global deal.
Why is Mexico and Latin America important in this?
I think that what's been very interesting and impressive about countries like Mexico and Brazil is that they have been, partly because of their status and partly because of the imagination that these countries have shown, they are acting, if you like, as a bit of a bridge between developed and developing countries. They are classed as developing countries for the purposes of the discussions that are taking place, and they are showing that they can be ambitious in cutting carbon emissions. And I'm very admiring of what Mexico is doing on climate change, with its ambition to cut its emissions by 50% by 2050, and a host of other measures on the way to that. So I think Mexico is an ideal place to have the major economies forum.
How confident are you that you can get a deal on the table?
You've got lots of things which, in a sense, make a deal more difficult. I'm optimistic, though, partly because of new American leadership, partly because of the role that countries like Mexico are playing, and partly because I think China, who are really crucial to a deal, as well as alongside the United States, want a global agreement. And I think there is real will in China to make this happen, because they see the effects of climate change on their own country. So it's a big uphill task, but I think it's achievable.